And for you all that don't know, I'm Sean Kingsbury, CIO for the Recovery Accountability and Transparency Board. Horace.
Horace Blackman, I'm the headquarters CIO at the Department of Veterans Affairs. Okay. And as Sean was saying, this is an interesting time we're living in. We're looking at things such as the healthcare.gov initiative that's going on right now, the challenges. We've got some huge data sharing issues at play. We have issues within the Department of Veterans Affairs where we're relying on other departments within the government, other third-party vendors, the private sector, or what have you, to really enable and facilitate the sharing of data in a meaningful way to support and enable mission. So we've got a great panel of folks who are joining us today. So first I want to start by introducing the panel, have the folks introduce themselves on the panel, talk a little bit about what they're doing, a little bit about how they're seeing the nature and landscape of data sharing, and really what their perspectives are on the notion of how do we enable data sharing to allow agencies to perform. So I will start. Started that in. So please, the floor is yours, sir.
Yep.
Okay, good morning, everybody. My name is Niall Brennan. I lead data analytics at CMS, Medicare and Medicaid Services.
You can't turn your mic on.
How do I turn my mic on?
The switch.
The switch. First item of data.
Try that again.
Oh, there we go.
I'm Niall Brennan.
Little data question, first of all.
I lead data analytics at CMS. In that capacity, I kind of deal with data across what I call the data lifecycle, from collection to architecture and storage to analytics and dissemination. We're facing a whole range of challenges at CMS at the moment regarding better understanding our data, sharing our data with more and more people in order to fuel and accelerate health system transformation. So there's never a dull moment.
Awesome. Mike Wood?
I'm Mike Wood. In September I retired. Previous to that I was the Executive Director for the Recovery, Accountability and Transparency Board. If you were in the earlier session, you heard Earl, the former chairman, Sean. We built some very transformational things, and I can talk about some of those today, and some of the other work we're doing. Right now I'm doing IT consulting. I'm working with CGI primarily, the Devaney Group, which is Earl's group, and a few others, but primarily for CGI at the moment.
Cool.
Ira?
Hi, good afternoon, good morning. How's everyone doing? Well, won't be a lot of questions out of this group, Sean. My name's Ira Hobbs. I like to think of myself as a citizen at large, and I am here representing the American people as we talk about this subject of big data. And that's important to me as a citizen because, one, I'm a veteran, so I'm hoping that Horace is getting my records and everything up off the floor and straightened up over at the VA. You know,
yeah, you were in there, I saw.
I'm a traveler in this country, and so I want to know everything about everything before I leave to go anywhere. And so I'm very concerned about how government is going to make this transition from providing us with little data to providing us with big data. And so I think do you want us to talk about where we are on that issue, or just stay with the intro?
Sure.
Okay. My perspective is fairly simple, and that is, regardless of the terminology, I look at big data in the same way I look at any effort on the part of government to change, to go from doing something one way to going to doing something differently. And big data to me is no different in that respect. It boils down to just a couple of issues. Governance. How are we going to make this happen? I know from my own personal experiences in government that it is difficult within departments sometimes to get agreement around how things are going to be done and how things are going to be handled. And as we start talking about data, there's no department out there that can exist on its own. They're all interdependent, and so to be able to get them to come together in a governance kind of a way is an extremely important component of what we're doing. Secondly, whenever we start talking about change in government, you cannot leave out the importance of how the workforce itself is going to be affected, both from a retraining standpoint in terms of new skills as they embrace new technologies, And also from the standpoint of those who will refuse to change, who will understand it as they always have, and how you deal with that aspect of the workforce. And then the third component is the new workers that you bring in, who are bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, see data as open and transparent and belonging to everybody else, who then are impacted by the culture. So those are the issues, and we go from there. So Sean, I'm going to stop.
That was awesome.
But before I do, I want to give a shout out to my presidential management intern colleague, Amos Townsend from the IRS, and I want to give a shout out to my ex-boss, also presidential management intern, Ann Reed.
Okay. Bob.
Wow, you make it a little tough to follow there. That's all right. Good morning. My name is Bob Dix. I'm the Vice President of Government Affairs and Critical Infrastructure Protection for Juniper Networks. It's an interesting discussion today. 10 years ago, I was fortunate enough to serve as a staff director for a subcommittee in the House Government Reform Committee. And we were just beginning to talk about the implications of security and privacy around data mining and data sharing. So here we are 10 years later, where the world of computing, storage, and networking has changed so dramatically with big data and cloud and virtualization and all those challenges. Where I'm going to come from is a little different than my colleagues this morning. I'm going to come from a standpoint of the work that we have been trying to do to engage the public and private sector together to try and establish timely, reliable, and actionable situational awareness to make this nation safer and more secure, and how the ability to gather, correlate, and analyze data contributes to our ability not just in cyberspace, but also in the physical world. So through the course of the conversation today, we'll talk about how we are enhancing our ability to automate the exchange of threat indicators and get machine-to-machine capabilities in this world of cybersecurity in particular, but how we do that, protecting privacy, protecting PII, and making sure that we get to near real-time situational awareness to improve our ability to detect, prevent, and mitigate, as opposed to so much of the time we spend today in response and recovery. Appreciate the opportunity to be here.
Okay, thank you to the panel.
So let's kind of step back now and let's actually look at the title here. We're saying how data is changing the way agencies perform. Can policy and guidance keep up? So the first thing I'd like to ask you all, because I mean our goal is to have this be as interactive as we possibly can, right? How many of you all feel that are federal or industry that there are challenges right now with sharing data from a policy standpoint? How many of you actually feel that you don't get the needed guidance so you can make informed business decisions? How many of you feel you don't get any guidance? Okay, so that's interesting. So just looking at the type of feedback that we got there, let's start off here asking the panel, what are some of the legal types of impacts that you think that you've experienced in sharing data? Let's start off within an agency, and then we talk about what does it mean between agencies.
So I'll take a first cut at it. I mean, sharing data within agencies, certainly within our agency, is actually, there aren't that many legal barriers because we come under the HIPAA umbrella. There's the main problem is that there's a lot of silos. So the provider people have their data, and the beneficiary enrollment people have their data, the Medicare Advantage plan people have their data, and on and on and on and on. And generally, people have happily existed in their little sub ecosystem without the need to share their data across the agency. Now that we need to be more nimble, agile, on top of things, get quicker feedback on how both the agency is doing and the healthcare system as a whole is doing. It's really about breaking down those walls. Some of the data is still, pretty protected even internally. Some proprietary plan, bid information and the like is more restricted than others. But really the challenge is getting the data from multiple sources, applying standards, assuring the quality is there, and then having the right people ask the right questions, and just banging it all day long until you get some interesting answers.
Awesome. And I think that was an interesting point where you said getting answers to questions, because in essence that's what it's really all about in this space, is being able to ask questions of the data and get useful returns. on what that means. And then you get into the way you get those, the returns richer is going to be based on the different data sources you pull together to enrich it, increase the quality. But I think that's a good point to walk away with. Mike?
John, I think there's a couple of points I'd make. One is what we did at the Recovery Board when we created the Recovery Operations Center in Iraq. In part, we were successful for a number of different reasons. One, we had collected our own data using standard data. We knew what it was, we knew what the standards were. That got us a leg up. Two, we collected data from a lot of disparate sources, which hadn't been done a lot in the government before. What we ran our analytics against was data from a wide variety of sources, which gave us some unique insights. Part of the issue we ran into was people's willingness or ability to share data. I just mentioned last January we hosted a data forum with GAO and with all the IGs, SIGI, the Council of IGs, and the RAP Board. It was something I had conceived to look at what are the issues around accessing data, sharing data, and some of the analytical tools that we had. And when you look at issues relating to access of data, there were a number of them. There were policy issues. There were just issues of people not being willing, the incentives not being willing to share data because of quality, because of lack of standards, because of legacy systems where you really didn't have APIs or the ability to easily get at the data and look at it. And then there's a series of legal issues, HIPAA being one of them. Looking at health data is difficult if you're not in the healthcare umbrella. The IRS has their own restrictions on data, obviously, and that's a rich source of data that really can't share across government. And then you've got Computer Matching Act and some of the privacy concerns in that, which prevent people from sharing data and doing matching. It's a very, I think, interesting dynamic. It's something that one of the recommendations of the data forum, and if you want to see the report, you can go on recovery.gov, and there's actually a featured story on it in the data forum, or you can go on the GAO site and get a copy of the report. But we made a series of recommendations, and one of them was we ought to look at legislatively at this whole Computer Matching Act and the matching provisions around privacy. You don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but you're at the point now where if you had paper documents and you wanted to do a comparison, you could do that. That's legal, but if you start matching computerized databases, that could be illegal. Or you at least have to jump through a lot of hoops to reach agreements to be able to do that. So the government, I think there's a series of issues and policy issues around being able to share data. When we can share data, we've got some real interesting capabilities with these new analytical tools that we have that would allow us to do that. And one thing we're looking at now, I think there's a couple of different things that I'd point out. One is we're starting to move into the unstructured data. We're very good at structured data. Computer science is really, in the end, it's all ones and zeros, so it's, at some point, it's all structured. But if you look at financial data, we're usually pretty good at crunching that up. We're very good at the transactional pieces of that. We're not so good at moving it around through the ETL process, and I think I'll mention maybe later on a few processes that are coming about, I think, that will hopscotch us past some of these ETL problems and some of these data standard problems. There's some things happening with Hadoop and some other sort of point-and-click solutions that will get you around some of the problems we run into right now with standards. But standards is really another, that is a big policy issue. Earl mentioned, I think, in the first session, the Universal Award ID. Christina Ho talked about, trying to do things with treasuries, talked about standards. It's a big problem for us, and it's something we've got to address. Dave Williams said, we've got to address this, or we're going to have problems. So.
Awesome.
Sean, I won't repeat a lot of the things that Mike said, but another aspect to that has to do with where I often found the most difficulties was around appropriation law. What comes out of the Congress directing agencies with respect to, in many instances, whom they work with and how they work together, particularly in organizations where you might have multiple appropriation committees that are providing the guidance and the direction for departments. But one thing that Mike did say, which really gets at it, is that there are a few things out there that prevent us from sharing data, but most often when you really sit down and you go through the mechanics of it, you find out that interpretations within departments are probably more of a pitfall than anything else. I take one small instance, for example. You know, there's one ethics law as far as I can understand it, but you go to every department in town and you'll get a different interpretation of what that means and then how it impacts all of us as we try to go to various conferences, participates in things. You know, some agencies you can, some agencies you can't. You see that same kind of thing kind of revealing itself in those activities. So for me, I think that the real big constraint is going to be about how agencies embrace this concept and how agencies move forward with it in terms of creating the right kinds of circumstances and situations for folks to work together collaboratively.
Did you say something about legislation coming out of Congress?
Oh, Bob, when they're in session.
And you even said something about appropriations bills coming out of Congress?
So before he said, he actually has the absolute best sense of humor across the board.
So in this business, one better, and especially when you're amongst friends. So look, where I'm coming from, again, it's a little different than my colleagues, because what I'm trying to talk about here today is developing a capability that I believe our nation needs, and most Americans would be surprised to know that we don't have today. And that is the creation of something like a National Weather Service for cybersecurity, and the ability of how data can enable a capability to make our nation safer and more secure. And the challenges are a little different, some of my colleagues here talking about within the government. When you start talking about how the private sector works with the government and some of the policy and legal ramifications that are reflected there, listen, we live in a world today where the legal framework we operate within was built and passed when we lived largely in an analog world. The laws have not been examined in a long time to reflect the needs of a digital world, and that must happen. That's a role for the Congress, that's a role for the White House to provide leadership around that, to look at the act you talked about, the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, the Computer Storage Act, even the Telecommunications Act, to update the laws to reflect the needs of the digital world. But what data can empower, and I'll just take a second here to just demonstrate. What data can empower is bringing together the ability of the private sector to be able to identify anomalies, abnormalities, and even malicious activity on the network. Match that with threat intelligence that comes from the government. And you put those two things together in a near real-time capability. Now you're talking about being able to predict hurricanes. You're talking about being able to predict floods. Some of the weather activity that we see, we need that kind of a capability in the world of our national and economic security protections to be able to improve the ability to detect, prevent, and mitigate. Frankly, folks, we spend most of our time today in response and recovery. The data capabilities of correlating and analyzing enables a new way for us to improve our protection profile.
Now Bob, you mentioned, you brought up a good point, this collaboration between the private sector, the government, in a way to leverage data to be able to do things we can't do right now. This morning we had a lively discussion about things such as the blue button. How do we leverage data from the government, various government agencies, the private sectors, other entities to come together to enable effective decision-making, effective performance management within federal agencies? We've seen things out there right now, the healthcare.gov website, which relies on the ability to leverage and share data and use that data from the federal government, many different agencies, HHS, VA, Department of Defense, CMS. You've got the different state and local entities. You've got the healthcare provider, and the list goes on and on and on. We're seeing these initiatives come out now which really are driving the interdependency and the interuse of a widespread, wide array, wide source set of data set to be able to deliver a set of capabilities. What I'd like to maybe pose a question back to you, as we see this world evolving, we heard last night where the world is going. We've got some initiatives this morning. We talked about Blue Button, a couple other things we saw that were these small point solutions, which really was leveraging data from other places. Where do you collectively see the biggest challenges, and not just the challenges, but really the solutions that we're going to look to overcome those challenges going into the future? And Bob, I'd like to start with you on that.
Thanks. All the hard questions go to Ira, by the way. So a couple things have to happen. First, we talked about the legal framework, but there's a lot of cultural changes that we have to have, both across the government and industry and how we work together. Right now, we still live in a largely need-to-know world. We have to move to a need to share and a responsibility to share world and break down some of those impediments that we've had for a long period of time. We also still, across the government, live largely, all due respect, in a lot of silos. And that has, in and of itself, within and across agencies, impeded the ability to be able to create the environment that you described, which I think, on behalf of our citizens, is absolutely imperative that we move in that direction. So with the leadership of people like the two of you and others that are in the room here today, we'll continue to bring that understanding of how important it is to move more horizontally and the ability to facilitate that correlation analysis that we depend on.
Ira, your perspective on this. I mean, you've been a CIO in Treasury, you've been a CIO in agriculture, you've been in industry, you've been outside. You've seen this from a number of different lenses.
Harsh, that just simply means I stayed ahead of the Grim Reaper. That's all that means. My perspective is, I don't disagree with what Bob is saying. I think that those are very important pieces and elements that we have to deal with in terms of how we press ahead. It's easy to say, it's difficult to do. It's like, you know, I heard a gentleman trying to explain ROI on prevention, which is almost impossible to do. You know, we need, quote, a fundamental change in government. Now, what does that mean for me? It means that, you know, we've been doing computer matching, fairly successful, but within certain parameters and things. We need to take those parameters and break those shackles off and apply this across the government, because what we're starting to talk about is transparency in everything that we do. We need to find ourselves in situations and circumstances where we're getting governance models into place that work kind of like, you know, one for me is Business USA. I mean, you got a lot of different agencies who are coming together there looking at improving the whole way in which government interfaces with business and almost being a single portal into that. We need a way to say that everybody does not need a shared service organization. We need maybe one, maybe two, maybe three. You know, I was talking to somebody the other day, we talked about data center consolidation. How many times do you recall us doing data center consolidation in the last 15 or 20 years? It seems that every 5 or 6 years, we do data center consolidation, and somehow or other, there's a proliferation and all of these centers come back. We need a fundamental mind shift in that respect, that there are certain things that we have to do and that we're going to do well, and it's going to involve changing the way we've done business in the past. Now, I can't define it beyond those kinds of words, but I also know that we gotta freshen our workforces on both sides, because, you know, it's always easy to point at and say what the government workforce is like and all this other kind of stuff. But we got a lot of that in the private sector too, because it's not your tier one folks who make decisions for your companies. You know, it's graybeards like me who make decisions for your company. And so we have to find a way also to really refresh our workforces with folks who grew up sharing data. You know, my son, I don't know about your kids, my son doesn't talk to me, he texts. He texts all his friends. He's up at 11 o'clock at night, it's quiet in the room. You know, my parents would have been glad for something like that to go on. Me, I'm scared to death. I don't know what's going on in that room, because what's he in there doing? He's sharing data. He's got a network of people that he's talking to all over the world. It comes natural to them. It is not natural to us. I love what Bob just said. We grew up in an analog world. We didn't grow up in a digital environment, and our kids are, and we got to give them more of a shot to do the kinds of things that we sometimes seem incapable, or because of how we have been cultural-wise in our environments in the federal sector and private sector space. You know, it's always adversarial. It's all about me and mine. It is about my sandbox. It is about keeping others out. It's all about not letting anybody else in and work for that. And that sounds very basic and it sounds very simple, but I believe that fundamentally that's where we got to go. And until we get there, right, all this other stuff is great stuff, it's beautiful stuff, but until we get there, you know, and we can't do it incrementally. like, you know, at education, they say it's okay to bring your devices to work, and over at transportation, it'll be another 10 years before it happens over there. It's got to be much more in sync, synchronized, and we all got to be pressing forward, because the real danger is the rest of the world seems to be coming together on it, and we seem to be falling further and further behind.
So actually, so let's mix this up a little bit, because that was an interesting point when you start to look at the youth, right? There's this whole space that we live in now where it's funny. My 11-year-old son texts me now. It's crazy, right? Like that, but that is an interesting deal when you say there are expectations, right, of how things are supposed to be in the office based on the life at home. I got to give it to Microsoft actually, because they actually did something interesting when they said we're going to call this the PC, personal computer. If I get you at home, I'm going to get you in the office, right? But I think we're at that turning point now where we have to come up with a balance of how to actually provide that level of capabilities within an office and business construct that's already taken place on the social side. So with that said, what would be two big wins when you look at federal and sharing, right? What would be two big wins? Let's do almost like a run through of two, like, quick, what do you think would be two big wins for federal in the space of sharing? With all of these other variables of security, policy, legislation, I don't want people to see that I have data issues, right? If I share it with you, you're gonna try and hold me to some of the data quality issues. All of those types of things. What would be two big wins for federal?
So, gosh, I'm first.
Gave you time to think.
You know, I'm just so drab.
Yeah,
and
what about one, John?
Okay, we'll do one.
Drab and colorless compared to Iris. So, you know, again, what I see as a relative newcomer to the federal government, and other people have touched on this, I mean, the biggest win, I think, is cultural change. And cultural change is actually hard because you're trying to achieve cultural change at a time when it's actually a pretty tough time to be a federal worker with, you know, furloughs and different things like that. There's also a huge, you know, there are opportunities and challenges. There's a huge, you know, pending exodus. There's a lot of people near retirement age, so the challenge will be having the, you know, ability to replenish the workforce, you know, with folks who can bring new perspectives, new skill sets, but just this getting away from a culture that, you know, I can't share my data with somebody in case they find a mistake in my data, and that makes me look bad. I mean, you know, for me, it's about transparency. You know, if you don't share your data because you're afraid of that, then nothing ever happens. The problem never gets fixed. Your data never, you know, helps to fix other problems at the agency. So for me, that's one of the most important things that could happen.
Cool. Mike?
I'm going to take a slightly different twist in that some of the things I've been thinking about, and I think what happens is, you know, if you look at it from a computer science and a technology standpoint, technology changes very, very quickly, changes faster than people assume it's going to. And I think the technology changes are going to drive us. I think they're going to solve some of our problems in ways that we haven't thought of yet. And just as an example on this whole data sharing issue, I think we're going to hopscotch around this whole data silo and lack of standards and not worry about it. I think we're going to do some things with processes that are very, very different. If you look at the way we think about things right now, you know, I want data from HHS, I want data from Treasury, I want data from HUD. Why am I moving all this data around? I really don't want to do all this crazy ETL stuff. I really don't want to worry about the things. I want to probably use some intelligence to assess the quality of what I'm getting, but I'll probably do some things that are much different. I'll probably do some things, one thing GP and I were looking at was using Hadoop and MapReduce jobs just to go out, send the business sort of requests out and pull the answers back to try and get away from sort of doing ETLs and putting metadata together with all those different data sources and stuff. We're creating a whole nother world of big data with metadata, sucking things out of existing databases. There's some other products. Sean, you and I were working on this whole unstructured issue that we got into when we started working with Department of Justice on housing, on mortgage fraud, and then moved into another area on just looking at just audit reports, the A133 audits that people have to do when they receive grants and so forth. And we went through a whole series of products that could analyze unstructured data, Iconics, Endeca, Inspire. UReveal does something pretty interesting. That's another one of the products. It's more of a point and click. You can just point at the database, and it really doesn't care if it's structured, unstructured, or what the standards are, and you can actually use it against the databases. So I think we're moving. I think technology is going to sort of hopscotch past these issues when you define what the problems are: lack of standards, disparate locations for the data, and so forth. There's ways to deal with that that are different than our traditional ways that we think about. Well, let's ETL it all to a central source and then we'll manage it. That doesn't make a lot of sense. So I think we're going to see some movement in that area. I think there's going to be a push for transparency, for opening the data up, and there'll probably be some techniques developed to sort of move beyond what we see as walls in front of us right now that won't be a problem for us. Cool.
Well, Sean, I'm a Jean-Luc Picard kind of guy, and
but are you assimilated? That's the question.
no, earlier version, not the later. I'm a Jean-Luc Picard kind of guy, and I look at what happens on the Starship Enterprise, and it's all about the boxes on the table, but everything flies into the box. Wouldn't it be great if we had some monopoly systems in government that simply told you all you needed to know about a certain facet of the work that's there? Now, I realize with the multiplicity of programs that we have, the different laws that support them and all this other kind of stuff, that may not be possible in the next 3 to 4 years, okay? You've got to wait a little while on that. But, is there any reason why we couldn't have one system that helped us hire, fire, and recruit people, as opposed to the literally millions that we have in government now? Some that bring in the right people, some that bring in the wrong people, some that don't know how to let people go, some that don't know how to find people. Is it possible that we in government could do that? I think absolutely. I think absolutely. And I think with the technology aspects of it, instead of a 1 to 13, which is 1 to 15, is that supervisory ratio now 1 to 15, 1 to 13, something like that? Mm-hmm. And I think the processing average for government is like 1 to 20. You could get 1 to 2,500, 1 to maybe 25,000. I don't know. But a system that everybody in government uses. Therefore, the President of the United States can come in and peruse his or her entire workforce, as opposed to asking for a report and it trickles through 50 layers before it happens. Now, some folks have said that'll never happen. And in fact, if that was the mindset, it probably never will. But it seems to me that in this day and age, we ought to be able to do that. If the military can account for 2 or 3 million people, hell, can't the government do that? I mean, we all know who got to pay taxes, right? How many taxpayers in this country? Probably got one process that keeps track of all those, right? Am I saying something wrong here, Amos? We probably got one, it's a hodgepodge, I realize that, but it keeps track of a lot of people who got to pay taxes, right? Why can't we have our backroom operations like that? So we can push one button and get a clean ledger. Why can't we do that in the government? That's what big data to me is about. Answering the why can't we do that question. That would be it for me.
So win opportunity would be the ability across the federal enterprise to move to a capability of continuous diagnostic monitoring in your enterprise to improve the confidentiality, integrity, and availability and security of that data that you are both gathering and that you are sharing. So I think that would be a big win if the government was successful in being able to move to that capability.
Now I think I appreciate it, Bob. Thanks. I think we have done a good job, and I think the panel has done an amazing job defining this challenge. But along the guise of what we heard last night, I have a lot of, I won't say how many years of experience we've got on the stage here, but it's many.
You're not talking about me when you say that.
We have a distinguished panel with a lot of years' experience here. The question is simple. We've got a number of challenges on the horizon. We've got agencies that have divergent missions. The things that we're asking of our departments, our agencies, and the government is not becoming fewer, it's becoming greater. What's the future behold for us in terms of how, if you put on your glasses, if you will, you're getting into your crystal ball and look into the future, your contact lenses from last night, right?
Running a query, right?
You run a query. Where are we going to be 5 years from now in terms of how agencies are using data, how that data is central and germane to the execution of their mission? You guys have seen it, some of you 20 years, some of you longer. You've seen the progression. You understand the technology. What does the future behold? Bob, I'll start with you.
Lucky you.
Oh, you won't pick a now.
Bob,
I thought I told him all the hard questions went to you, or to Mike or Sean. So, the notion of being able to connect everything and empower everyone. I mean, we haven't talked about the Internet of Things yet. We haven't talked about how the whole technology is moving. So being able to predict 5 years from now is really a challenge. But I think it's sort of what all of us talked about earlier, is the mindset and the culture of how we work together is what needs to evolve. And I would call it an evolution as opposed to a dramatic change, because that just doesn't happen in government. It doesn't happen real fast in the private sector either. It's an evolution. So understanding what the needs are and how they fit to the mission is absolutely critical. But leveraging technology, I mean, again, we hear a lot about this today, but I would argue that the world is delivering technology solutions at an unprecedented pace in history. We may have a gap in adoption. So understanding what the market is delivering and how those tools are available to meet the challenges that we face in our mission capabilities. Having that vision, but having an open mind, Horace. I think that's really important. Just because we've always done it one way doesn't mean that that's the way we always have to do it going forward. We need to open our mind, and while we chuckle a little bit because we've worked together for so long, the notion of even the couple examples that Ira made in terms of creating those capabilities, most people would be surprised to learn that we haven't been able to advance to that. So I think that's the commitment we have to have. It's going to take leadership, it's going to take an open mind, and it's going to take a willingness to take a little bit of risk in order to move the ball.
Horace, how many people were in the first session? I was absolutely amazed to hear an IG talk about preventative measures with respect to audits, waste, fraud, and abuse, investigations, and all of that kind of stuff in his organizations. When he talked about radar and tripwires, it brought back, bad experiences for me, but I understood clearly what he meant. These are things that send off flares that let people know that there's something here that isn't right. If the IG community, who I hold in great esteem and fear of, right? Okay, if the IG changes from really coming to the office saying, I'm here to help you, as opposed to, they come in and they ask you into a room and they lock the door behind you and then there's no paper on the thing and all that other kind of stuff. But if it's really in the way in which our colleague described it this morning, and that permeates the IG community across government, that's a huge change. Our speaker last night talked about words disappearing from our vocabulary. Can you imagine what could happen with predictive analytics in this particular sense, like radar and tripwire, that is basically stopping us from doing bad things, what it could mean in terms of the role of the IG truly becoming a helpmate and a part of the team? That is absolutely phenomenal. If we can take that and apply that in other areas. But true to form, as Bob said, 5 years from now, we're going to have some folks who are going to be all the way up the food chain. And then we're going to have those who are dragging behind. What we want to do is get everybody up the food chain as fast as we can, as efficiently as we can, because that's what's going to change the way we see things. Most of our competitors around the world are not burdened with infrastructure. They don't have, like in some communities, the Verizon Fios is buried under the ground, but you still got the Comcast cable box on the corners and you got somebody else who's coming in by hardwire. You go to places like Singapore and the entire downtown is wireless. That's how they're making progress, how they're leapfrogging us. So we got to do that where we bring everybody along at the same time in terms of what it is that we're doing. And examples like that, clearly to me, are the hallmarks of what we should be expecting and demanding from our government over the course of the next 3, 5, 7-year cycle.
I agree. I think we've had a hard time with the
Well, and
IGs.
budgets are not to jump in, but budgets are going to impact that too, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Budgets are going to
Well,
impact.
budgets are going to be shrinking. I think the challenge is going to be, and you know, if I look at what happened at the recovery board, we basically started with a clean slate and we were able to build a technology organization. We had a lot of tech-savvy people, so we could work hand in hand with our contractor colleagues and actually get a lot done in a very, very short time. And I think, Ira, when you said we got to bring everybody along, we've got a lot of knuckle draggers, people that are sort of out of the primordial ooze, still working in the government. You really need to move. I'm sorry. I should
Write that one down.
I shouldn't be so harsh. But I think you've got to look at the workforce, and the government workforce has to shift over to be a more modern workforce. I see, you know, as new people come in, people are, it's like your son texting and stuff. People are used to technology. They're growing up with it. I got a picture of my 5 grandkids at a party, all sitting around with their iPhones, and they're all, you know, 6 years to 3 years old, and they're all sitting there playing video games and stuff. It comes as second nature to them, and I think that's sort of where we're moving. As the technology improves, I think the workforce has to sort of move along with it, and we have to figure out, I think industry is now starting to see a return on investment from IT. In the last 10 years, there's a real return on investment in the industry. You don't go rent a car and have them pull out a bunch of paper for you anymore. Everything's electronic. I think the government has to move that way, and I think it will. I think it's just a little, government's always does things a little slower. But part of that is you've got both the technology component and then you've got the people component. You've got to bring the people piece along with it. I think the workforce, 5 years, definitely 10 years from now, is going to be very, very different. I don't think we're going to, hopefully we won't be working 40 hours a week. We'll let some of the technology work for us, but that's a pipe dream.
So I guess I'll represent the knuckle draggers.
Out of the primordial ooze.
Let me clamber up out of the ooze. I actually think the future's incredibly bright, and I say that because of speaking for our agency. If we continue to make the progress that we've made over the last 3 or 4 years, really the sky is the limit. We're sharing and leveraging data internally and externally in ways that were almost unimaginable. A couple of years ago, you mentioned Blue Button earlier. CMS, along with VA and DoD, has the only and I guess most successful implementations of Blue Button. We're way ahead of the private sector in that regard. Over 500,000 Medicare beneficiaries have instant access to machine-readable 3-year claims history across physician, hospital, and drug data. We're sharing data with accountable care organizations on a monthly basis that actually give providers the ability to see the whole of a patient as opposed to just the patient that's in front of them at that particular time. We've made huge strides in quality measurement, huge strides in public availability of data. The hospital charge data release earlier this year in May or June that shone a light for the first time on the vast disparities in what hospitals charge for the same services. So when you look at that progress and then just look at the petabytes and petabytes of data that are coming down the pike from electronic health records and patient generated data, you ally it with the technological advances and the sort of the human capital changes that we think are coming down the pike. I think we're just going to be using this data in ways we couldn't even imagine. Patients and providers and payers like CMS are going to have it at their fingertips. 4 years ago, we were relying on outside academics to tell us what the readmission rate was 8 years ago. You know, like, so it was coming, there was a JAMA article or a New England Journal of Medicine article that would like give us a 5-year-old number. Atul Gawande once said the healthcare system is like driving a car that tells you how fast you were going 5 miles ago. And so we've gone from that situation to now routinely generating basically real-time readmission rates that can be sliced and diced all the way from the national level down to geographic levels, down to the individual hospital level. And it's not, so there's the, oh cool, we're doing that perspective, but you know, I'm a kind of an outcome-driven guy. The really good news is that readmission rates are actually declining after being steady for basically time immemorial. So that's kind of the intersection of, you know, data, all the different provisions in the Affordable Care Act, accountable care organizations, readmissions penalties, actually working to do something that's, you know, very worthwhile, keep people out of hospital, improve care, improve quality, lower cost.
Okay. So let's get, you know, ELC is about collaboration. So let's do this part a little different, right? Let's have questions for our awesome panelists, but also a couple of things that are working. It'd be great to hear from some of you, right, briefly, about something that's actually working within your area from a data sharing perspective. Because I'm thinking that we all can learn from each other in that space. So I'll say let's have a mixture of questions in this space, as well as volunteer to actually talk briefly about a success within your agency, right? Or how you're supporting an agency, if you can talk to it. Briefly.
We have a rich audience, in addition to the panel, we have a rich audience of people here. And I know some of you, so I can actually start picking people out I know have good questions and good answers. Please.
Ira is the representative of the citizen. One of the things that I think many citizens, as excited as we all are about the explosion of data and the capabilities that it offers, I think the general citizen is pretty concerned about privacy. Mm-hmm. So could the panel address how you help the citizen to understand how their privacy will be protected at the same time the data can be used to further all these wonderful advances?
Bob?
Privacy, man.
Yeah,
cybersecurity.
No mean to give you all the hard questions, but
I thought we had an understanding about that when we started this. So thank you for the question very much, and that's obviously a legitimate concern in a lot of ways. So let me approach that from sort of the standpoint of where I was coming from, because there's a lot of misunderstanding as well out in the community about when we talk about sharing information, what that really means. You know, there are some that think we're talking about sharing birth dates and telephone numbers and things of that nature. And what I'm talking about in trying to create this capability to improve upon our security, privacy is part of that, and it really is more about the exchange of metadata and ones and zeros to be able to identify patterns and trends of behavior. That's what I'm describing. That's a little different than what Sean was describing earlier, but he can talk about that piece because it's really important. But there's this notion that that's not taken into consideration when these programs are built, and that's just not true. Are there violations? Are there compromises? Certainly, but part of the whole capability building is to improve upon confidentiality, integrity, availability, privacy, and security. So that's, I think, one of the jobs, especially we in the private sector, need to do a better job of educating and messaging about when we talk about sharing data, what that really means in terms of the context of personally identifiable information and some of the other elements. Because in most cases, what I'm talking about is really about ones and zeros. And in the case where we're using the data that is customer generated or generated from a business, in the examples that I am familiar with, that data is all anonymized before it goes into the relational database capability to try and identify those patterns and trends to help issue alerts and warnings. So that's an important piece that we can do a better job from an education and messaging standpoint about what exactly we mean when we talk about sharing information and data.
Yeah, what I would say. I want to add on to what Bob's saying, and that is, I think the education and all of that is very good, but I think it's very difficult to convince citizens that data is private. When you have situations like what just came to light with NSA, it's hard to get people to believe that data is private. And, you know, I give you practical examples. You know, they say, well, turn off your laptop when you sit up in one of these coffee places because somebody will be in there stealing your data. And there are people who actually go in and that's what they're doing. Some folks for nefarious reasons, other folks simply because they have the tools that allow them to do so. There's a certain amount of the public who believes that stuff is not private, and they're glad it's not, because again, it's about the prevention of things that occur equally as well. So this issue on privacy, I believe, is real strange. Yeah, I want it private if it's just about me. No, I don't want it private if it's about somebody else who's going to do something bad. I want you to be able to get hold of their information. I want you to be able to strip it down and find out all about it, where they live and everything else. So I think that's another conversation that we have to have, because in the analog world, it was like, I don't want you giving out my name, my street address, my social security number, all of that kind of stuff. But in a digital world, where people use computers and technology to do very, very bad things, we want our government to know. And so I think that's another conversation about what privacy is going to look like in the 21st century that we have yet to have in this country.
Yeah. Question?
So I have a question, or an answer, and then a question.
Okay.
So an answer to your question, Sean, was can we give some examples of sharing? I work for a company that provides big data analytic platforms, and we have many federal agencies that use this. And where they've been successful in sharing many times is because they've been mandated, or there's been legislation that has forced data providers to give them data.
Just so you know, that's a very important point that, you know, it's good to find that fire, find that mandate that helps to enable that sharing.
And would these people have voluntarily given this data? No. Another example was a project we just did for an HMO, which was correlating asthma attacks with air quality data. And we couldn't find any really good correlation until we included prescription data that indicated that people who didn't take their asthma medicine, were more likely when air quality degraded to get an attack. But in my particular healthcare, my prescription medicine is managed by one company, my doctor is managed by another, my dental is managed by another, my eye care is managed by another. I'm sure these people don't share information. So short of mandating sharing, can you give us success stories where people have voluntarily shared information?
We voluntarily share information all the time. HHS has been sort of an early adopter of open government and open government principles. We've released hundreds of data sets over the last 4 or 5 years that were not previously available, data sets on hospital, nursing home, home health quality. I talked about the home health, the hospital charge data that was downloaded 250,000 times in the first 24 hours after release back in May. We've released public use versions of our claims files that have been to address the concerns over there. Obviously completely de-identified and anonymized. We've released synthetic claims files that look like real claims and act like real claims, but are actually seeded from lots of different people, so you don't, again, inappropriately create an opportunity for anybody to re-identify folks. So I would say we volunteer to do it all the time. I mean, your point about, you know, providers, we sit on a treasure trove of data called Medicare claims. The only reason we have that data is that providers have to give it to us in order to get paid. If they didn't have to give it to us to get paid, they wouldn't. Medicare Advantage plans, the private plan carve-out for Medicare, for many, many years, you know, didn't have to give us that data to get paid, and so they didn't give us the data. And then they were, you know, required as a condition of participation to start providing the agency encounter data. So we're just getting a stream of that to the agency now. So that's going to be more information on a big chunk of the Medicare population, 10, 15 million people.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. So you are the magic question.
I actually have a great example of data sharing across state, local, and federal government.
The floor is yours.
I work with the federal judiciary, and up until about 5 years ago, whenever an offender who was under supervision by a probation officer moved, we were required to transmit that information to local, well, we still are by law, to local and state law enforcement agencies. Yeah, we sent a letter. Not very effective. Today, we've implemented a system where if you're an authorized agency and they're in the tens of thousands, we actually transmit this information, the address, the name, the criminal history, and the photo, which we never did by letter, to those state and local agencies. They can see in real time if a sex offender, if a drug dealer has entered their neighborhood. I think it saved us a ton of money, because can you imagine what those letters were costing and pulling them out of our databases? So, here we go.
Thank you.
So the question I want to ask is, let's talk a little bit about the challenge of zeroing in on what is the right data or the meaningful information. This was alluded to in the first session earlier this morning, and you know, as we live in this era where we've got big data and we've got access to all of this data that's sort of surrounding us, the question oftentimes, whether it's a matter of trying to convince the public that their data is actually protected and remaining private, or whether it goes to the challenge of continuous monitoring from a cybersecurity perspective, or from the perspective, Neil, that you're dealing with at CMS, the question is, how do you actually identify and zero in on what the meaningful data is, and how do you actually make it actionable? So what I'd like to ask is, you know, what is your perspective in terms of that question, and what do you see as the particular challenges in the, you know, the sectors that you're working in that relate to that today?
So I'll take a first shot at this. While I'm a huge believer in technology and the ability of, like, you know, computers and, you know, Hadoop, blah, 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 to make everything run faster. There's no substitute for subject matter expertise and kind of a thoughtful examination of the data. I think, you know, big data for me has become almost like a term of amusement, and not in a good way. I think it's about smart data, and you know, having people, you need kind of subject matter experts, you know, call them data scientists, call them programmers, whatever you will. You need to give them the tools to explore the data. You need to allow them fail, because for every, you know, 5 theories they might test or hunches they might follow, 2 or 3 of them could be wrong, or 4. But there will be, you know, there will be successes, and those successes will be really, really important. So that's, you know, the key for me.
I think it's interesting, a couple things. One, if you look at, we had less than 100 data elements in the Data Act, or in the Recovery Act. Of those, we probably use 50% of them routinely. There's a lot of data that's collected. Just because you can't collect data doesn't mean you're going to use it. There was a very interesting academic study. SEC has done a pretty good job of standardizing data, you know, the required XBRL, and things like that. Some of the academics were looking at that, and they were looking at, I don't know how many data elements they collected, it's a lot, but, and they also make a lot of that information open to the public. You can access the information through EDGAR and so forth. These guys looked at percentage of data elements that were being used, and it was about 20% that were being used on a routine basis. So we are getting into this sort of era where we can collect things, we can manage things, we can analyze things, but it's really a certain number of key data elements that we should be looking at. And applying standards across the board is expensive. I think it behooves government to sort of narrow it down to the nub of what you really want, and that also gets to privacy questions. What do you really need to know from people? And the less generalized data you collect, the better off I think you are.
You know, something interesting that I kind of had this thought before the session started, and I was taking note, I was counting to see how often a certain word was actually used in this discussion. Like last night, you know, the whole concept of words disappearing from our vocabulary was discussed, right? I thought that was an interesting discussion, right? Now, there are a couple of things that, and I'm looking at somebody in the back, right, so it's going to resonate with him, that now it's an assumption that certain things are going to be in place to achieve these business outcomes, right? Meaning, cloud was only said one time in this session. Think about it. And there is no way that in many ways for you to actually get these types of outcomes, right? And again, cloud could be public, private, all of that stuff, right? That, I'm going to say industry and federal made cloud cloudy, which made you not think about solving these types of problems, because it's really about getting the work done, meeting the objectives of the organization from a mission standpoint and deriving outcomes, right? But it's really interesting to say that now there's an assumption that I can get the level of assurance for me to put my data in certain places now, right? There's an assumption that I can crunch. I mean, you listen to Niall. He said, oh yeah, it's like it's nothing. Oh yeah, we're cranking through petabytes of data, right? Not a problem, right? It becomes real interesting now because now it's an assumption that you can do that and you can accomplish those workloads now, right? So the interesting piece is that I'm thinking that we're going to talk less and less about cloud per se, and more focusing on delivering results, meeting the mission, dealing with the policy and those types of things, right? But I think that how many of you all agree with that? Do you feel that you're in a different place now when you start talking about the infrastructure that's going to deliver those services, right? I just saw a couple of hands go up, and now, but the funny thing is now you're thinking about it now as an afterthought, right? And I'm just saying.
Just as often as you didn't hear cloud mentioned today, so we're keeping a running dialogue on camera too, the discussion. The word
What?
cloud will be 1,000 times. It's culture.
Yep.
Right? So that's the piece that's not going
So-
away.
Damn it, not primordial.
Man, that cultural intelligence still in the room that we have to change at the societal level, at the public level, at the private level.
But there has to be a convergence. There has to be a
Absolutely.
convergence of a lot of these things we've talked about here today. The culture, the policy, the legal framework, all have to, the rules of engagement. Because as has been demonstrated today, there are some huge human, medical, social, law enforcement, other benefits that can be derived by this capability. So, but it also has the other side of the coin. And that's the rules of engagement, understanding what do we need to update in that cultural, legal, policy environment. How important, we haven't talked much today about identity and access control. We haven't talked about some of the needs to have a true strategy for implementing that so that we have an understanding of how we're going to protect ourselves and the privacy elements of that. So there really has to be a broader conversation more holistically about where we're going, not just as a nation, but because we're so connected globally, how these rules of engagement are going to operate moving forward in that time frame you talked about, even in the next 3 to 5 years. Unless we have that conversation holistically and just deal with it in the one-offs, we're going to miss things, and the bad guys and gals are going to have even greater opportunities if we don't get a convergence of that dialogue.
You know, the other thing, I think in addition to the notion that we only heard cloud once, I only heard the word infrastructure once too.
Yep.
So what we're saying here is that we're entering a phase, if you will, of infrastructure agnosticity, if there's such
Exactly.
a word, that says it's not about the infrastructure, it's not about the cloud, it's not about where the bits and bytes are stored, it's about information you have and information you have access to, and how do you take that data, quote unquote,
Turn it into
to
useful
enable something to support the mission of whatever you're doing. I've heard a lot about culture, I heard a lot about people, I heard a lot about, knuckle draggers. What was it? Ooze.
Ooze, that's the word, right?
Ooze, right?
Yeah.
So the big takeaway for me from this discussion is that, when I think about data and I think about what we're doing with data, it is not, far be it from me to say, an IT problem per se. Right. It's a cultural, organizational transformation that has to be undertaken that will change the way we use information in order to support the missions of these organizations. From the private sector side, you have to think about sort of how do you enable government to do the things we do, and how do you position it? And it's about how to really channel back the things we use, the data we need access to support the things that everybody on this panel has talked about. So with that, I want to thank our panel. This has been a rich and engaging discussion.